Magandang araw po sa inyong lahat. I hope you're all well and in good health. Today, I'll be taking a step back from the usual teaching context and I'll focus on an educational setting outside the classroom. My name is Frances Doplon Perez, and I'll be talking about the home as a site of language ideology. Now, what is ideology to begin with? Let me borrow from some definitions from Bernard Spolsky. Now, according to Spolsky, ideology is about assigning values and prestige to certain elements in society. Now, how does this apply to language? He says, language ideology refers to underlying assumptions about language and language use that constitute collective beliefs about language teaching. Now, what I'd like to focus on today is the prevailing belief among parents in the Philippines that multilingual households are disadvantageous. This belief is actually nothing new. There's been a lot of research about it, and it's very much tied to coloniality and the country's colonial history. In his work on linguistic imperialism, Robert Phillipson traces the development of structural and cultural inequalities between English and other languages as a result of countries' colonial pasts. He also discusses how linguistic imperialism has found its way to beliefs on how English should be taught. Now, one of the myths he uncovered is the subtractive fallacy, or the belief that if other languages are used much, then the standards of English will drop. At its core is the perception that the use of one language leads to the deterioration of another. It's as if one's potential for language learning is finite. Now, related to this, in the local context, Isabel Martin examined myths about Philippine languages. And one of the misconceptions she identified is that English and Filipino are languages in opposition. In her chapter on periphery language teaching, she explains that these two languages, the language of the colonizer and the colonized, are perceived to be languages that cannot coexist in the same space. For example, in schools, it's either English is the sole medium of instruction or it's not there at all. So there's a relationship of displacement. And this brings me to another belief, which is rather prevalent in language learning scholarship, the notion of first language interference. So when I looked it up, I found something interesting in the definition of interference when it comes to language acquisition. It actually refers to the influence of one language to another. It doesn't even matter if it's about the second to the third, or the third to the first. It's simply the influence of one language to another. Neutral, di ba? And we can always say if it's positive or negative. So what do we have here? The term influence is neutral, but the term interference, which is often used, is not. Interference has a negative connotation, bringing to mind disturbance, deviation, or even disruption. So the coinage of the term language interference is ideologically packed, especially since it's often the first language that is framed as the offender. We rarely see it the other way around, lalo na kung yung incoming language ay English. Now, all of these provide a theoretical grounding to the perception that multilingual households are disadvantageous. So, where exactly are these beliefs found? I'm part of this online community of mothers of Filipino children, perhaps the biggest, with 43,000 members. Now, every now and then there are posts about language, and I'm happy to report that there is a strong support for multilingualism. However, a closer reading of comments reveal persistent attitudes that are symptomatic of an ideology that views multilingualism negatively. I've clustered these comments into three different strands of belief. The first strand is the belief that multilingualism confuses very young children. There are comments which parents conclude their infant or toddler was confused by the presence of another language at home. My child was confused, my daughter was confused, confused talaga yung term na ginagamit nila. Now, they claim that multilingualism leads to bewilderment and consequently less talk. The second strand is the belief that multilingualism hinders language development. So there are comments where parents reveal that their child has a speech delay, and they had been advised to use one language only. So the thinking here is that a multilingual environment causes and aggravates these delays. Finally, the third strand is the belief that multilingualism prevents effective language learning. One comment attests that it's better to speak straight English at home without mixing with other languages in order to receive best results. Another comes from a teacher who claims that using more than one language results to difficulty in learning English. Now, what we see here is an overall belief that multilingualism is an interference. Sagabal raw ito. It interferes with early language development and with English language learning. So, how is this belief challenged? Let's see what the sciences say, beginning with social sciences. In social linguistics, there is this concept of translingualism. It is the view that languages are fluid and borderless. Borders are actually socially constructed and therefore have no psycholinguistic validity. So there are no separate language systems. In the mind, languages, all of these languages, form part of one's holistic, integrated, and collective idiolept for communicative meaning making. Actually, this makes sense to me as a parent because I've observed that the development of my kids' own language abilities have nothing to do with the number of languages. It's about the readiness of their bodies, it's about their cognitive development. And I even remember that when my kids turn two, our pediatrician goes through the developmental milestone checklist. And for language, some of the questions I'm asked is he able to respond to his name? Is he able to follow instructions? Is he able to describe his surroundings or ask for something using 2 to 3 word phrases? Back then, my youngest would say, "Help me," or "Akin yan," without knowing their equivalents in the other language. Usually, he even mixes languages like, "Eat ako banana," and our pediatrician hears us speak that way, and that's fine with her because they all form part of his collective ability to communicate. Our pediatrician doesn't ask about the number of languages. The concern is on the whole child development. Now, let's look at the health sciences. I contacted my cousin, Pamela Rogers, who is a pediatric speech pathologist and a faculty member at the De La Salle Health Sciences Institute. So I asked her what she thinks of multilingualism as an interference. Now, she explained that the starting point of multilingualism is bilingualism. And when it comes to language acquisition, there is simultaneous bilingualism, learning languages at the same time. And there is sequential bilingualism, learning languages one after the other. Now, their patients, the children, experience speech and language delays because they already have learning and developmental disabilities to begin with. But in their field, there's an observation that a number of parents and carers believe that simultaneous bilingualism has a higher cognitive demand on children. So, nahirapan na nga anak ko, papahirapan pa ng dalawang language. Yun yung pag-iisip dito. Um, but this is just a perception. Of course, we acknowledge the experiences and opinions of these concerned parents and carers, but perhaps they just haven't encountered an alternative perspective. So, my cousin sent me research from various journals in pediatrics, speech pathology, and developmental disorders. These studies basically compare children from monolingual and multilingual households. A study focused on kids with autism, another focused on kids with Down syndrome and other developmental disorders. And what I've gleaned from the research are these 3 points. While children already experience struggles due to their conditions, no aggravating effects were seen in kids from multilingual households. So the level of challenge remained the same whether monolingual or multilingual. Second, there is evidence that children with special needs are successfully able to develop second and even later third language skills. So breakthrough is possible. And third, what accounts for the patient's varying levels of language competence is the quality of input, not the presence of another language. So Bakit nahihirapan mag-Ingles? Ayon sa research, wala ito sa exposure ng iba pang wika, kundi nasa kalidad ng pagkatuto ng bata. So, their verdicts are similar. There's no conclusive evidence linking simultaneous language learning to additional language problems. Again, these are caused by pre-existing cognitive and physiological conditions, not language input. Now, I think these beliefs, often well-intentioned but misinformed, create monolingual pockets in our multilingual society. What do I mean? Pockets, bulsa, maliit, nakatago, pero may laman. So, situations where walls are put up between languages. One language only, no commingling, huh? Because there's a perception that language contact is dangerous. And by doing so, multiple languages are treated as monolingual entities. Multilingual ka nga, pero monolingual naman yung paggamit mo sa bawat wika. So, these actually reinforce the imagined monolingual worlds created by narratives of colonialism. Only this language belongs here. Only this language belongs there. No mixing. This is quite disconnected from the present day realities we find ourselves in, which is very multicultural. Furthermore, these beliefs reinforce the vicious notion that local languages are not enough, that they can contaminate and even adulterate. Only English is enough. So, in this presentation, we examined ideology that views multilingualism as a threat to language development and English language learning. These run counter to decades of research on the advantages of multilingualism, scientific research on speech pathology and developmental pediatrics, and the notion of linguistic diversity. Now, let me end with a quote. Charity begins at home. The home is a seedbed of one's values, principles, and beliefs, including those about language. And these can influence stakeholder driven language policies in years to come. Um, Not all ideologies are created equal. Some are more charitable than others. May we foster a genuine respect for all languages, for all peoples. Let's uphold beliefs that are inclusive, equitable, and empowering. Daghang salamat.